Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to be talking about and reviewing the fan translations that are currently available for the series of French exclusive Young Indiana Jones books. Now, these were done as part of a Young Indy series. The publisher was Hachette Livre. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, so apologies if I did. But they published the Random House books that I really have enjoyed and have reviewed on this channel, of course, in French, but then in addition to the 15 in that series, in 1997 they continued with additional original Young Indie stories. So these have never been made available in another language. This is just like the fan translations I've reviewed of the Wolfgang Holbein German novels. These are being done one at a time, and so I've read all 6 and will review them in a brief overview here. Now, these books are, of course, featuring the young Indiana Jones, and in terms of the timeline, it's basically picking up right after, and in some books, literally just after Fedora gives Indy his hat at the opening of Last Crusade. And in one book, Indy literally walks back into his father's study and tries to get his attention once again. So this is where these stories are sort of set, and there is some variance in the actual timeline placement, as I don't think proper series chronology and canon was first and foremost in everybody's mind writing these kids' books that were exclusively for French readers in 1997. So they relatively fit in the timeline, but some of these fan translations have rather nicely tried to adjust a few things here and there so they don't contradict with one another, and that they don't contradict with not just the Indiana Jones lore, but of course the timeline of the films, but also that they don't contradict with the Random House novels in terms of young indie stories or the Chronicles TV series, as some of the characters from the TV show do make it into these books. So, as with all of the young indie adjacent material that's technically official but wasn't exactly overseen by Lucasfilm entirely, there are some gray areas, and so this is a case where some of these translations have taken upon themselves to, I think the way they credit it as, make adjustments for Indiana Jones lore. So that was a nice touch I didn't expect. So there will be references to events from, of course, the Young Indie TV series, but also some fleeting references to other books in this series, but also the Random House books. So it seems as if these 8 original stories were meant to basically just continue the Random House series. But when you read these, while they're still aimed at younger kids and they're relatively short, somewhere between 120 to 150 pages, depending on the actual, well, really depending on the size of your e-reader or how you're looking at them. They're also a bit more simplistic in terms of the actual adventures themselves than what we see in the Random House books. What I loved about the Random House books, at least the first 9 I've been able to read, were that the adventures in each book were well done and fully fleshed out. So they worked even though it was a shorter kids book, and they felt satisfying even reading as an adult, and they had the requisite indie flavor. Well, here in these French books, when you read them, there's not always that same sort of satisfaction at the end. I think each that have been translated so far are good, fun little reads, but I think some are a bit more successful than others. But there's usually a feeling that they are very simple, straightforward stories with some having elements of the supernatural creeping in. But the trade-off, I think, is that you do actually get quite a bit of character introspection and development. And also in some of the books, you get quite a bit of interplay between father and son in terms of the Joneses, and a good deal of bickering and arguing, but also moments where they seem to come to terms with one another as complete polar opposites in terms of their outlook and approach to life. So I think that's actually the most rewarding aspect, that we get some more of the Indy and Henry Sr. dynamic that was suggested, of course, by other young Indy stories in the Chronicles series, and then, of course, picking up in Last Crusade. And there's a nice sense of continuity in these as one story flows into one another, and characters do return or continue over into other stories. The primary one in terms of Indy's sort of group of allies is Herman from the opening of Last Crusade, is in most of these books from the first one onward. So he's essentially Indy's chum who goes along reluctantly on the adventures. And as a Hardy Boys fan, it does remind one of the Hardy Boys' best friend Chet Morton, who's a bit on the heavier side and is sort of comic relief in a way. That's the sort of role that Herman fulfills in these stories, just as he kind of does in Last Crusade. So there's a good linkage to the films. We have characters carry over, but also there's a linkage to the Chronicles series directly, as the tutor Miss Seymour does make an appearance in these books, just as she did in some of the later Random House series. So this does have that olive branch to the Chronicles TV series, so it fits in with that. And you could tell the intent was at least there to some degree to make all of this sort of work and just continue what the Random House books did. Now, all of these have unified covers in terms of the art design. Each one has actually a quite nice stylized, almost sort of cartoon-looking action beat from the story with a nice sort of unified block for the title. And if you actually got the physical versions of these original books, I think they look quite nice. So it does make you wish that there was a official English translated version you could physically get. Now, the first book is Young Indiana Jones and the Phantom of the Klondike. This was written by Jerome Jacobs, and the books were mostly written by the same author or two, just like the Random House books sort of were split between one or two, sometimes three writers. But this is a rather simple, straightforward, shorter story where young Indy and Herman wind up essentially in the Pacific Northwest in Alaska looking for a lost treasure and cache of gold that has changed hands and mysteriously disappeared somewhere in the Klondike. Just like the Chronicles TV series, at times Indy will run into famous figures. Here at one point he actually runs into the famous writer Jack London, which is actually a nice little fun bit, and it's not quite as heavy-handed as the TV series could get with just shoehorning in famous people and figures that Indiana Jones would just run into. But there's a couple instances of that in these French books. But essentially, this is a very straightforward story where you basically have boys getting off to an adventure, and they go off in the Klondike looking for lost gold, and there's a malevolent presence that may or may not be some vengeful spirit out to seek some sort of revenge for people who had tried to get the treasure before and were, of course, never seen again. It's a pretty straightforward story. It's nothing very special, but you could very easily picture this being, a part of the Random House series, even though it's a bit more on the nose and is just a straightforward basic story. The only other thing of note really here is that this, of course, sets the dynamic of how these books are going to go, but also it establishes a new love interest for Indy who will actually become a recurring character in these books for some of them. So this starts the sort of continuity with just these particular French books. So while there's some linkages to the Random House series, this is basically a second series that starts with Phantom of the Klondike and then runs through these books in particular with unique supporting characters and little bits of bridging and connections. So if you read these, it does help to read them in order. The second book is translated under the title The Lost Vial of Dr. Curie. This was written by Richard Richard Bugge, and is actually translated by Dr. Ed Schneider, with the distinction of it being, as I said before, adjusted for Indiana Jones lore. So this is one of the translations that has little tweaks here and there to assure better continuity and not have any accidental contradictions, but make some tweaks so that the book properly fits on the Indiana Jones timeline and fits within the lore in terms of the other Young Indy works and, of course, the films themselves. This story takes place in 1912 Paris, where Indy is with his father, Henry Sr., on a trip to, of course, examine historical documents and finds. And, of course, young Indy is kind of bored out of his mind. They get dragged in to look at the ancient Parisian catacombs. Then they essentially become wrapped up in a chase to find the stolen, lost vial of radium derived by Marie Curie. And if anyone can get their hands on it, the idea is that it will be sold to the highest bidder for nefarious means. So this one, I think, with, of course, the Paris setting, more bickering between father and son, with some references to Indy's dog, and the recent death of Indy's mother still weighing heavily on everyone. I think this book is an improvement. I think there's more for an Indy fan to sink their teeth into. I think the setting, particularly most of the book takes place in the Parisian catacombs, with Indy and assorted companions running around trying to evade capture or escape capture, and being surrounded by skulls and bodies and corpses, long decayed. It's a perfect Indiana Jones setting, and it's perfect for young Indy. I think it really fits well. The story moves a bit more quickly than the first book, and there's at least enough complexities added to make it more interesting, I think. So this also being one of the books that's adjusted for Indy lore makes it flow a little bit better, I think, and you don't run into any quirks or issues that might not fit with the continuity. So all in all, I think this is an improvement over the first book, and it's got a really nice setting, which I really enjoyed. There's a couple mentions of famous names, and particularly artists. Picasso is name-checked, and of course, Indy mentions he knows and is friendly with Norman Rockwell. So, there's again a few little nods towards the Chronicles series, but one could very much imagine this as a Chronicles episode, with young Indiana Jones running around dodging criminals, looking for a radioactive vial in the Parisian catacombs. It's a great setting for a young Indy story. The next book is Young Indiana Jones and the Metropolitan Violin, again written by Jerome Jacobs, and again with a Dr. Ed Schneider translation with tweaks for Indiana Jones lore. This book starts with Henry Sr. being invited to the Metropolitan Museum in New York and taking Indy along as an attempt to once again try to rebuild their relationship, still reeling from the loss of his wife. So again, continuing this story thread rather nicely. Indy brings Herman along, and over the course of the story, we also run into Indy's love interest from the first story, Norma Bellini, the beautiful, young, aspiring opera singer. At the museum, the MacGuffin of the story emerges when a priceless Stradivarius is stolen by a desperate individual who also kidnaps Herman and absconds with him. And then Indy, of course, immediately takes chase, rather amusingly followed by his father, who's in over his head. And they run into others who are trying to capture this individual with the Stradivarius. It's a pair of gangsters, one of which is actually revealed to be a young Al Capone. So this technically is the first time that Indiana Jones encounters Capone, and there are some tweaks made here to actually make it fit better with the other times Indy met Capone in the overall lore, both, of course, in the TV series and then eventually in the Rob McGregor novel Genesis Deluge. Ultimately, the story takes detours to Niagara Falls, and because Henry Sr. is in on the adventure and is frequently in over his head, he's just as much comic relief as Herman is, but there's always nice bits of father and son bickering, and also moments of of character introspection that furthers their relationship. So this is, I think, an even more enjoyable story than the first two. They're basically getting better as they go along. The only issue with this is that it seems like perhaps there's a tiny bit missing from the climax, as it takes place on a skyscraper under construction, and then suddenly it's like there's a little bit missing because suddenly there's the wrap up and conclusion. So I don't know if it just wasn't in the source they were translating, or somehow it got removed or not included, but it just seems like there's a few pages missing from the finale. Again, I think the little tweaks for Indy lore do help the reading experience, and in these books there's occasionally a joke or maybe something that's more in the French idiom, or there's also a few little jokes at the expense of sort of elements of American culture that it doesn't, I don't know if it quite translates, or it kind of falls flat in areas. So some of these translations do sort of tweak some of those, or try to address some of that, so it's not a complete non sequitur or something that's nonsensical. The next book is Young Indiana Jones and the Bermuda Triangle, again by Jerome Jacobs. This one translated by Icy Bro, who did some of the Holbein novel translations. Now, this is a direct sequel to Metropolitan Violin. It literally picks up exactly after the events of that book. So it picks up essentially with our characters sort of relaxing in boats in Central Park just after going through the adventure of the previous book. And then we immediately get thrust into another adventure. Our gang of heroes encounter some new friends, one of whom is a young aviator who wants to cross the Florida Straits in his seaplane and be the first to do so, and thus prove himself to be able to finally marry his beloved, who's part of a rich family who looks quite down upon him. Indy, of course, jumps at the chance to do so, but has to do so against his father's wishes, so there's a nice bit of subterfuge of Indy actually getting to the plane expedition. However, things don't quite go to plan, and they wind up having to make an emergency landing, and then are essentially picked up and captured by pirates in the midst of the famous Bermuda Triangle. So they must then escape from the pirates, who take them to their secret hidden island base that is, as revealed, filled with all the spoils and all of the ships lost in the Bermuda Triangle. And rather interestingly, Indy and his friend find that the pirates have even become adept at using the island topography to grow and cultivate virtually every illegal substance and drug known to man, so they can essentially make and refine their own and continue their evil ways. So, of course, there's no way that they're getting off this island alive unless they make a break for it. Meanwhile, everybody back in Florida, most notably Henry Sr., is frantic with worry and begin attempts to try and find the missing plane themselves. This is a very straightforward adventure like all of these, but I think this is the best and most enjoyable. It doesn't have any supernatural elements unless you count a plane going missing in the Bermuda Triangle. This one definitely has a straightforward pulp action flavor and is very readable. I think it moves the fastest of these six, and it's the one I actually enjoyed the most. If I were to recommend any of these to someone to try, I would definitely say try Bermuda Triangle, because it's the best straightforward adventure of these, and it definitely reads like it's a short pulp story that you would find in a pulp magazine. That's the sort of good flavor it has, and what I think any indie story needs. So for me, it's the one I enjoyed the most. The last book that's been translated so far is Young Indiana Jones and the Sacred Meteorite. Again, written by Richard Bugn and translated by Dr. Ed Schneider with some tweaks for Indy lore. This finds Indy with a companion friend of his father's on a fact-finding expedition working with the local Inuit in the Arctic. And Indy is tasked with actually returning a sacred stone, which is actually a meteorite, to a particular special holy place so that the Inuit will have essentially assured peace and good harvests and good hunting. This is done every so often, and a particular person is tasked to make the long, arduous trek to the sacred mountain to replace the sacred stone. This is getting into perhaps mystical elements, so it does fit into the Indy realm. And young Indy also has a nice love interest of an Inuit girl who tags along this journey as they go on the arduous trek via sled dogs. It does seem perhaps a bit much that the adult chaperone and everyone else would say that it's okay for a kid to go off and do this, especially since he's supposed to do it alone, so they don't know at first that the girl has tagged along. But outside of that, it's a fun enough adventure. There's constant peril as they're being tracked by essentially a black marketeer who is after the stone himself for his own personal gain. And then they face various trials and tribulations just simply due to the terrain and the weather and being on thin ice or losing the sled dogs for a time. It's rather straightforward. Again, these stories are all pretty short, but the story of this one kind of goes in fits and spurts a bit. So I think it's still relatively effective. I think the best element is actually the Inuit girl who goes along with Indy being clever and resourceful, and there being some nice banter back and forth, and Indy not necessarily knowing all the ins and outs of Inuit culture. But it's also got one element that definitely crosses over into the supernatural, because there's one moment where after they actually crash the sled and have to recover themselves, Indy finds he's lost the Sacred Meteorite and is trying to find it, and it's gone deep in a fissure in the ice. So he uses a talisman that he's been given before they left in case something happened, and then essentially has an out-of-body moment where he communes with a shark spirit and then is assisted to find the stone once more. So that's the major sort of supernatural moment, and it's a literal out-of-body sequence. It's a bit odd, but it's still within the realm of indie possibility, I suppose. But it's definitely the most out there supernatural moment in these short books that you'll come across. Several of them don't have any supernatural elements, so it was definitely a sort of left turn to suddenly get a full blown out of body sequence. But ultimately, this is still a fun little read, but it's a bit spottier in terms of its effectiveness, I think. There's also one or two moments where some of the internal illustrations are either in the wrong place or get duplicated. These books do have a few rather nice internal illustrations scattered throughout that are included in the translation still, so you get that nice bonus as well. But this is probably the book that I'm most kind of on the fence about. It's probably between this and Phantom of the Klondike for being the most simple and straightforward. Then comes the last book that's been translated so far, which is Young Indiana Jones and the Spectre of Venice, released in 1998, originally written by Jerome Jacobs, and again translated by Dr. Ed Schneider with a few little tweaks to make it fit properly within the overall Indy lore. Now, this book is another straightforward adventure. It is very short and to the point, but the setup is essentially a means of getting Indiana Jones to battle a Phantom of the Opera-like figure in 1915 Venice. The setup is good in terms of how young Indy gets to Venice. He's there to visit his friend Norma Bellini, the continuing love interest of these books, who is there giving performances at the Opera House, and is also friends with the descendant of Casanova, Giovanni, who is using a submarine he borrowed from an inventor to search for his ancestors' supposed long-lost treasure. But he keeps encountering this mysterious diver who is up to seemingly no good in the Venetian canals. Indy tries to throw himself headfirst into this adventure, but of course his father is not too happy about this, and so once again we have some nice butting of heads between the two and further development of their relationship that continues to deteriorate despite both giving it their best efforts. This book is very action-packed and to the point, so unfortunately the plot doesn't develop much further beyond some searching for the treasure in this prototype submarine, being set in the location of Venice. Of course, in 1915, it's as World War I was getting underway, so there are some allusions made to the war, and of course some concessions are made to the Chronicles TV series, as Indiana thinks or reflects at one point about his friend Herman, who's been in some of these books, but then also Miss Seymour, his tutor. So there's some nods to outside of the particular book series, just as there are sort of sprinkled like breadcrumbs throughout all of these. Eventually, this Spectre figure makes his presence known and is essentially a phantom who runs around Venice in a white cape wearing a mask that resembles a classic carnival mask. After all of our characters are kidnapped and interrogated by this phantom and his forces to ascertain what they know, which is practically nothing, it then becomes a battle of wills back and forth with Venice in the backdrop, as the phantom figure's real goals are apparently to explode a series of bombs throughout the city, as he's the leader of a revolutionary group. The climax deals with Indy having to try and defuse bombs himself, and of course the biggest one is planted underneath the stage in the opera house where Norma is giving her big performance, with the phantom watching from the darkness. So again, it's essentially Indiana Jones getting to fight the Phantom of the Opera, because, of course, when he's unmasked, he has a horribly scarred face and is much closer to elements of the original Phantom in Gaston Leroux's story. So, I mean, it's an excuse to have Indy fight the Phantom of the Opera, except it's in Venice. It is a very to-the-point story, and the whole idea of the search for the missing treasure of Casanova kind of becomes secondary, and then there's a short epilogue at the end where the last little loose ends are wrapped up very quickly. So of these books, it is, like the others, a very short and to the point story, but this one has such a nice setting and such cool aspects to it that I wish it was longer. I wish it was a little bit more fleshed out, because essentially you've got Indiana Jones running around in 1915 Venice, the Phantom of the Opera planting time bombs everywhere, also menacing his love interest, who's an opera singer. And on top of all of this, he's still butting heads with his father, who gets involved in some of the action and at several points tries to intervene rather amusingly and rather strikingly, at one point holding a gun, which is not something you want Professor Jones to ever do. But then also he gets conked on the head a few times and gets partial amnesia in the middle of some of the escapades, which is actually quite amusing in ways. So in spite of it being a short and to the point story, there's a lot to really enjoy here, and it just makes you wish that it was a bit more fleshed out, because it's such an entertaining story that it obviously would have made a great episode of the Chronicles TV series if they wanted to play around with that. But then I also want to highlight something in this book that pops up that also is somewhat there in the other books, and that is a level of darkness and implied violence that pops up in areas that is far more than what you would get in an American children's book. In fact, there are moments in this book and some of the others that you would never get in an American children's book because no publisher would allow it. So here in Spectre of Venice, one of those moments would be when Norma Bellini is being menaced and held captive by the Spectre and has a knife to her throat, and Professor Henry Jones Sr. has to intervene with revolver in hand and comes very close to actually firing with his eyes closed. And since his eyes are closed, he is about to actually shoot the poor girl instead of the Spectre. That's one moment that you definitely wouldn't get in an American children's book. Another is that you have a, admittedly now teenaged Indiana Jones running around defusing time bombs as best as he can and hoping he doesn't blow himself or the city up and kill a bunch of people. But in the most striking moment that you would never in a million years get in an American children's book is when Indy actually manages to capture the Spectre and is trying to figure out where the last bombs are, because he suddenly realizes that there might be multiple bombs. He unmasks the Spectre to find a hideously scarred face, of course, which is described in pretty nice detail. Again, something you wouldn't get in an American kid's book. But when the Spectre is not willing to give up his plans, first, Indy knocks him out to deal with the major time bomb. Then he interrogates him further and almost chokes him to death. And then in my favorite moment of holy crap, this would never get in an American book ever, he borrows a gun and holds it to the head of the Spectre, threatening him with being shot in the head unless he tells where the last bombs are. And he keeps the gun to the villain's head when the police run up and tell him, "Put the gun down, son." Then uses the gun to the villain's head to force the police to follow them to the location of the last bomb, and then forces the villain to defuse his own bombs. Yeah, did not expect that in a kid's book. So that's probably the single greatest example I have of reading these books and encountering moments where suddenly there's some adult content or material that comes into what is supposedly a children's book, and something that would never in a million years pass in an American children's book or a British children's book or something. So those were unexpected. And the moment of young Indiana Jones, even though he's like maybe 15 or so now, holding a gun to the head of the villain and threatening to shoot him, and the text indicating that he will just go ahead and shoot him in the head. That was very striking, and something that you wouldn't even get in the Chronicles TV series, that's for sure. And if you doubt me, one of the illustrations in this book is of this particular moment. So you have the Spectre unmasked with at least some detail of his terribly scarred face, with young Indiana Jones, complete with fedora and everything, holding a gun to his head. I didn't know I would encounter anything like this reading this book, but I'm now really glad that I read this book, because when it takes a couple little dark turns, they get pretty dark. Unfortunately, there is one more original adventure in this series that has not been translated yet. These books are very rare to find and typically very expensive on the used market. So hopefully somebody can get a copy one of these days, and then one of the fans can do another lovely translation. But that remaining original adventure book is entitled Young Indiana Jones and the Child Llama. So overall, this is a fun little aspect of the printed world of Indiana Jones that I myself was not even aware of before digging further into the world of fan translations and fan works or fan fiction. While I don't think these are the best of young indie fiction, they're quite fun and do have good plot setups and some nice MacGuffins, and also some really nice character interplay between Henry Sr. and Indy, playing off of the development of how their relationship breaks up, dealing with the loss of Henry Sr.'s wife and Indy losing his mother, having more interplay between Indy and Herman going on these various adventures, putting young Indy in different locales, in some more extreme environments than what we see in the young Indy TV episodes in terms of the Chronicles. So yeah, it's a fun experience. I would recommend these to anyone who's digging into all of the indie books. I don't think they're as good as the Random House books, but it's a sort of natural progression, and it's really fantastic that fans have made these wonderful translations freely available. So I'll have links to these in the description below if you wish to read these yourself. I definitely think it's a good idea to at least give them a try now that we have the ability to actually read them, as opposed to tracking down obscure French paperbacks from the 1990s and then being able to actually read in French, which I can't do. So this was just something I found out about once and thought I'd never really get to look into, and suddenly I realized, oh wait, there's more of them and there's translations now. Oh, I have to look into these, and I'm glad I did. So again, I would recommend these to anyone who's on a similar sort of read every Indiana Jones bit of fiction quest. There is some fun to them, and there's a nice sense of continuity that's greatly enhanced by the books that have been given the tweaks for indie lore. So as always, I hope my babbles about the world of our favorite archaeologist adventurer has been at least somewhat fun and informative. This is a very obscure section of indie lore and printed Indiana Jones storytelling, but again, a rather unique and fascinating one, and these are original indie stories, so they should be examined as such, and technically at least added into the canon somewhere, even if they're just a footnote or they have to be, again, tweaked for indie lore. So definitely give these a try, especially if you're like me and you really enjoyed the Random House Young Indie series. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some wonderful indie books, and keep supporting the incredible efforts of fans who do these translations as labors of love without any attempt to profit from them, simply doing this because they love the character like we all do, and try to make every bit of indie fiction available, which is otherwise locked to obscure, long out of print texts in other languages. So definitely keep cracking the whip, keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.